Hi, this is Michael Jones, Chairman and CEO of Caravel Concepts. Welcome to Market Insights, our commentary on financial markets and economic events. Let's get started. In this video, we're going to talk about two risks that investors are probably going to be hearing about for the rest of 2021. They've certainly been dominating headlines for the last week or two. And that is COVID, oh yes, COVID, as if you haven't heard enough about it, and inflation, oh yes, inflation, as if you haven't heard enough about that. And if you're sick of both of those two topics, well, I'm afraid you need to just buckle your seatbelt because you're probably going to be hearing a lot more about them. And so we want to talk about these two risks, their connection, even codependence, and how we should be thinking about financial markets for the rest of the year in light of these two looming risks to financial investors. I know we are enjoying a summer free of mask requirements and social distancing, and things are open, and you're like, can't we just move beyond COVID? And the answer is unfortunately not, because COVID infection rates are starting to escalate significantly. And ICU units across the country are starting to fill up. This time, not with 75 and 80-year-olds, but with 25-year-olds. And the reason is because of new variants of COVID that apparently are much more infectious to younger people. But also, let's face facts. Medical science, giant pharmaceutical companies delivered effectively a medical miracle. They delivered effective vaccines against COVID in less than 9 months. And then, to one degree or another, virtually every government around the world completely botched the rollout of these vaccines. Why do we say that? Well, let's talk about the US and the EU, because we have very similar problems. In both cases, there's tons of vaccine available, and yet inoculation rates have plateaued well short of the 70% of people necessary to achieve herd immunity. How come? Politics and safety concerns, both of which have been utterly bungled. Neither the EU governments or the United States have been very good at reassuring people about the safety of these vaccines. And probably more importantly, they've been absolutely atrocious at calming the political divides. You know, at the end of the day, you would hope medicine wouldn't be a political issue. But unfortunately, almost from the very beginning, COVID has been. And it's not just in the US. We have some of the poster children for the people who've been most politicizing of this pandemic, but it's been happening overseas too. And that's why the US and the EU are both in similar situations. And what that means is we have a huge population in both economic blocks, the two largest economic blocks in the world, of unvaccinated people, and particularly unvaccinated young people that apparently are far more vulnerable to the new Delta variant than they were to the original COVID vaccine. But if you're saying, well, did somebody else do it better? Well, not really. The UK made a bet on a one-shot vaccination, even though the vaccine manufacturer said you need 2 shots. The UK government said, well, why do we need to listen to scientists? If we only give 1 shot, then the vaccines will go twice as far. And that's absolutely true, and it was fine against the original COVID variants because 1 shot was pretty effective against that. But against Delta variant, 1 shot has almost no efficacy. Give the 2nd shot, you go to 95% efficacy against Delta. But of course, you gave people 1 shot and told them to go home and have a nice life. 11 million UK people have not gotten that 2nd shot, and based on that, they thought they had achieved herd immunity with 1-shot vaccinations because they're over 70%. Take into account the people who've only had 1 shot, you're back below 50, and you're in the same boat as the US. It gets even worse when you go further overseas. China put a lot of time, energy, and prestige into their COVID vaccines. They have made COVID diplomacy a big part of their foreign policy, where they're giving away vaccines to all kinds of emerging markets. There's a problem though. There's a lot of research that seems to indicate that the Chinese vaccine is not very effective against the Delta variant after 2 shots and even after 3 shots. And can we have an honest conversation about that? Apparently not, because the head of the Chinese health organization gave a speech saying, hey guys, I know we got some concerns about how effective our vaccine is. We're really researching it, and we're thinking maybe if we supplement it with some of the Western technologies. That's what he said in the morning. By the afternoon, he was giving an interview. I was misquoted. There is nothing wrong with our vaccines. And you're like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? This seems like somebody in the Communist Party got kind of upset about your candor, and you're totally changing your story. And if we can't have an honest conversation about whether Chinese vaccines are effective, remember, a huge percentage of the emerging markets are relying on Chinese vaccines for their COVID strategy. If they're not as effective against these new variants, we need to have an honest conversation about it, but apparently that may not be possible. And then last but most tragically, India had everything going for it. They had great policies that kept the COVID from breaking out in the early days of the COVID outbreak. And the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world is in India, the Serum Institute of India. And the CEO of the Serum Institute made a courageous bet. In May of last year, before any vaccine had been approved, he started making vaccine. They bet billions of dollars that these vaccines would be approved, and they were. So India had this huge head start. They didn't have a very bad COVID problem, and they had the vaccine supplies. So what did they do? They didn't order any vaccines until January. They only ordered 11 million, and they told Serum Institute, we don't need that stuff. We want to be like China and give our vaccine away so we can lead in vaccine diplomacy. And of course, when COVID broke out in the Indian country in February, March, and April, there were no vaccines available to really contain it. Now India has reversed course, and now 100% of serum's production has to be reserved for India. But this, you can see, wherever you look around the world, it looks like we haven't done the job we could have and should have done on the COVID vaccine rollout. What that means is COVID infection rates are indeed back on the rise. I know you don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. I don't even want to say it, but it's happening, and it's happening in a younger population. And so that's something we're going to continue to deal with, right? Does that mean that financial markets are at risk, or the U.S. economic recovery is at risk? In my opinion, no, and here is why. First of all, the economy will probably slow because of this COVID outbreak, but it won't dip into recession. Because if you are worried about COVID, you are going to go get a vaccine. And if you're not worried about COVID, then you probably have always thought that COVID risks were overstated, and you're not going to change your behavior just because there's another COVID outbreak. And there's just no political will to force you to start wearing a mask again and closing restaurants and bars. So the fact that you're willing to go out and spend your money means the government's not going to prevent you from spending your money the way they did a year ago. And so I think the economy is going to keep churning along. And mortality rates are probably not going to be nearly as high. Because remember, we haven't done the job we should have done on vaccination, but over half of the country has been vaccinated. That means that ICUs are filling up, but they probably won't achieve the level of stress that they achieved during the first part of the pandemic. And let's face facts, the lack of vaccination is young people, people in rural, and people in the South and Midwest. That means that medical resources can be poured into these areas from areas that are more fully vaccinated. All of this suggests to us, will the economy face a headwind? Probably. Will that headwind put us into recession? No. And if the economy faces a headwind, then that may give the Fed permission to keep printing $120 billion a month And that $120 billion a month they're printing is a huge support to financial markets and equity prices. You saw huge inflation numbers released this week. We've got inflation levels that we have not seen since 2008. And obviously it's going to be nonstop chatter. There's going to be really ugly testimony on Congressional Hill talking about how the Fed has printed so much money, things are out of control, the Biden administration's like Jimmy Carter, blah, 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 blah. All right. This is probably the most important risk for investors to keep in their eye on. Not because inflation per se will derail a bull market. History says investors don't care about inflation until the Federal Reserve cares about inflation. When the Federal Reserve cares enough about inflation to stop printing money and start raising interest rates, that's when your equity markets are going to have a real problem. Until then, you can have real high inflation. We did all through the 40s, the early 70s. The stock market can keep, or excuse me, not the early 70s, the late 60s. The stock market can keep pushing higher. All right, until the Fed says, I'm hitting the brakes. So, what would cause the Fed to hit the brakes? Remember, more COVID, more headwinds, but also more supply constraints, more difficulty meeting production targets. And that could mean more inflation and continued shortages. We think, though, that the Fed will kind of be arguing sort of like a dog chasing its tail. COVID is causing shortages. Shortages are causing inflation. COVID has caused the shortages and the inflation, therefore, we're not going to stop printing money. We're not going to worry about increasing interest rates. What that means is that as long as the Fed keeps seeing this as temporary, as long as the Fed sees a goalpost out there that someday we're going to get enough vaccinations and enough arms that COVID will recede as an economic constraint, and all these supply constraints for chips and lumber and bricks and all the things that are escalating in price across the economy, those shortages will be relieved, the inflation will come back down, and the Fed will then say, all right, now we can start slowing the printing presses because the economy is no longer constrained. All right? If that's the logic that the Fed follows, and we think it is, that means that the connection between inflation and COVID, and the fact that COVID is that headwind to economic growth that gives the Fed the permission to ignore inflation and keep printing money, that's far more important to financial markets than the immediate economic growth or short-term inflation pressures. Thanks for joining us for Market Insights. We hope you found it informative. If you did, we'd hope you can like the video and share it with your friends. If you want more of our thinking about the COVID pandemic and the connection with Fed policy, you can check out our new Strategic Insights. And you can get all of our research by subscribing to the link below or checking out our website, caravelconcepts.com. Thanks.
The link between COVID and inflation, is it that we don't have, so our supply is low for our commodity, and is it because people aren't working, or is it because we just don't, there's not enough stuff? Like what's happening?
So the answer to that is yes, and yes, and a little bit more than that beyond. So you said, is it because people aren't working? Yeah, you still have workforce participation has not come back anywhere near back to where it was pre-COVID. You've got people with concern about childcare, having to care for elderly parents, that they can't bring COVID back into that household, or they're worried about it still for one reason or the other. You've got people who are receiving unemployment benefits who are saying, you know what, I'm going to have a fun summer, then I'll go back to work. There's all kinds of things that COVID has depressed workforce participation, and therefore that creates more inflationary pressures. Every business you go in is desperate for people. They're having to raise prices, and they can't create as much stuff because they don't have the workforce they need to create as much stuff as is demanded. Well, when you have less supply and more demand, that's inflationary, and you can see the COVID connection. The other COVID connection is there are inefficiencies and barriers to just getting stuff done beyond just workforce participation. Right now, chip supply is a huge problem in the global economy. Most of the auto factories in America are shut down right now because they can't get chips. Where are chips made? South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, China, 3 huge production centers for chips. You can't go from Taiwan to Japan, Japan to South Korea to China. There are all these COVID travel restrictions. So what would normally be all these executives and production engineers flying around trying to solve these bottlenecks and increase production and get these chips to the market, okay, Zoom can only accomplish so much. This is a physical thing that is produced, and there are physical limits on what's happening in the production, and the ability to coordinate a production response across 4 countries that are the primary source of chips is incredibly inhibited because you can't get on a plane and go there and fix the problem. So this is another way that COVID kind of throws sand in the gears of the global economy and increases inflationary pressures.
Yeah, and the other issue, I guess, is in the strategic insights we talked about the problems with Japan and other Asian countries were having, that they didn't want to bring in other people's vaccines. They wanted like an Asian vaccine. And so, because it seems to me the way that you would solve that problem is America has all these vaccines, people don't want to take these vaccines, okay fine, let's send them somewhere else, maybe to these places that create the stuff that we need.
Yeah.
And then they can send it on, but if they don't want our vaccines,
well,
solve that problem.
And we need to be careful because when we say they don't want those vaccines, I think if you went to the man on the street in Japan and said, "Do you want these vaccines?" it'd be kind of like the U.S. The majority would be say absolutely, and then there would be some that saying, "Are these tested enough? They really did this really fast." So the safety concerns are there, but the bigger issue in getting these vaccines widely distributed is they started way behind us. And I mean, we need to exclude China from this. China developed their own vaccines. They may be of questionable efficacy against Delta, but they developed their own vaccines, and they're not going to let Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson or Moderna come in. No, we're going to use our own. Whether they're any good or not, we're going to use our own. That same mindset, it's called the Asian development model. It's an export-led economic model that says we want to consume what we produce, and then we want you to consume what we produce. We're going to export. All right? Now, they may say, well, we're going to make an exception in this case because we don't make this vaccine. We need in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, we need this vaccine. We don't have, our pharmaceutical companies didn't invent it. But then you got to get through the bureaucracy and the regulations and the red tape that for the last 70 years in Japan, 50 years in South Korea, 50 years in Taiwan, the rules, the regulations, the bureaucratic mindset is if it's from overseas, we don't want it. Put barriers in the way of people getting into our market with foreign products. That's the mindset.
They don't have their own vaccine.
And that's the problem. That's the problem. There's a time when a bureaucracy would say, okay, this time we really want that Pfizer product.
Right.
But a bureaucracy doesn't work that way. There are rules, there's a checklist, there's a mindset, and those bureaucracies slow walk the approval process for foreign products in every category. There's an inspection routine for American bats to be used in Japanese baseball leagues that makes them price uncompetitive. All right? It's a baseball bat.
Right.
All right? Now imagine the process and the rules and the regulations for a foreign pharmaceutical product.
Right.
It's like such a huge regulatory hurdle that it just takes time to get through, and that put them months and months and months behind the U.S. and Europe in starting the vaccination process. So we're saying we're terrible. We're like 55%. Well, they're at 10.
There's other countries that
They're the Japan, South Korea. They're way behind that.
Well, I wonder why, again, with America having all of these vaccines that we're not using, they do have an expiration date. Can we be, we know how China is. China's trying to get everybody into their pockets. Remember that time I helped you, right? So it seems kind of like America as a leading country should be, well, we've got these vaccines. Do you want these vaccines?
The Biden administration started that about, probably about 4 or 5 weeks ago.
Okay.
You can imagine, until we got to the point where you were no longer waiting in line for a vaccine,
Right.
there was zero political support for starting to send our vaccines overseas.
Of course, yes.
But now that we've got the surplus, Biden, his first response was, we're going to make Pfizer and Moderna give their technology to foreign countries and let them produce it, which was crazy. Because once you let go of the technology, you're never going to ever sell them this. He then very smartly listened to Senator Ben Sasse, who's a Republican. He wrote an editorial in the Wall Street Journal, said, that's crazy. You give away this technology, it's just another generation of American jobs lost. Give away the vaccine, let them be made here in America. And Biden goes, you know what, he's right.
Yeah.
He's a Republican, but I'm going to acknowledge when he's right and I'm wrong. He changed the policy 180 degrees. Now we're giving away the vaccine. Just like China is, only our vaccine, there's no one who's denying that the Pfizer, the Moderna vaccines, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines are all incredibly effective against the new Delta variant. So when we give it away, we're actually helping people.
What countries are we sending them to?
I don't know the exact list off the top of my head. I do know that Japan is also starting to give away vaccines, even though they haven't vaccinated enough,
Yeah.
but they're giving away the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca vaccine. And the reason is because it's an infinitesimal little risk, as we said in an earlier video about the risk of the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca.
Right.
There are blood clot risks.
Yeah.
In really, 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 really small. But Japan said, you know what? Pfizer, Moderna, we're going to use yours. They had already signed contracts to buy all 4 vaccines.
I see.
So they're using 2 of the 4, Pfizer and Moderna,
The other 2.
and they're giving away Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca. Even though they still have long lines of people waiting for vaccines, they're saying, well, this is good enough for you, but
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
not
yeah.
us.
Yeah.